We are getting a few visitors to this video blog, so I'll continue with it as long as there's enough people watching. I've got on order a poll for my cell phone, so at some point I'm going to go out into the city of Portland here and show you some landmarks connected with my past life. But until that time, I have a little research journey to take you on today. It's going to take a little bit of time. I'm sorry it's going to be a little longer than the 8 minutes that I usually aim for. This is kind of convoluted, but we are going to start with a psychic reading with a medium that I had back in December of 2010. I wanted to connect with my past life wife, Abby, who is my wife in spirit today. But at that time, I had a pretty good sense that she was Matthew's soulmate, and I was trying to connect with her, and I had felt that she was trying to connect with me. So I'd already had one psychic reading that had put us in contact. That was back in March of 2010. So now we're in December of 2010. I've chosen another medium. This is Joseph Scheel, who is also a psychic artist. And there were a lot of hits that he made in the course of that reading. It was kind of interesting at the very beginning, his cell phone, he was at the Boston airport, and his cell phone kept dropping the call like 5 or 6 times, and he was ready to refund my money, and I said, no, let's keep trying. Finally, it worked. So one wonders about these electronic glitches. But in any case, whatever might have been trying to interfere with what we were doing failed, and the reading went forward. And there were a lot of hits, more so than I realized, because some of these things I found in the historical record as I was researching over the next 10, 11 years. But apparently Abby felt like it wasn't strong enough. So at the very end, he says something to the effect of, I hear M, Mathew, Methuen, like that. Kind of trailed off on the second word. So I was really excited, but I didn't want to show my feelings, or give him any idea, because I was careful about what I told him and didn't tell him. So I said, would you repeat that? Just, say that again. He said it exactly the same way. I was hoping he was going to say the second word a little more plainly. He said, I hear M, Mathew, Methuen. So I wrote it, I was taking notes in real time, so I wrote it down as Methuen, M-E-S-S-U-E-N. Later on, as I did a little research, I noticed that there's a town right next to Matthew's hometown of Haverhill, Massachusetts, called Methuen. And I said, and it's the only town with that name in the United States, probably in the world. And I said, well, I bet you that Abby was trying to tie the name Matthew with the town of Methuen, and she's telling us that we lived in Methuen, which is something I had no idea about. I had never heard of the town before. So I kind of left that on the back burner. I didn't know how to prove it. I looked into Methuen a little bit. I didn't see anything in my research that would indicate that. But in the meantime, on eBay, this came up for sale. Now this is the Boston Weekly Museum. It ran from mid-1848 to mid-1852. And I knew already that Matthew had written some of his Ethan Spike letters to the editor in this paper. So I went ahead and bought these two off eBay, and I looked through them. They're very ratty. These are old ratty copies. And there's 2 of them. I looked through them, and I was disappointed because I didn't find anything that looked like it was Matthew's work in them. So here, I'm going to go ahead and take these out. Now in this video I'm going to have to edit in some close-ups, because there's a number of things that have to be seen close up here that I can't show you on this camera. Anyway, I was literally photographing this to resell it on eBay, and on this second page I found an article called, see if I can show it to you. That's the, well, that's way over here on this side. I'm dyslexic. There it is. How the Cows Were Won. So I read it. It's written by somebody named Quails. It says, How the Cows Were Won, or Who Was the Laziest Man? An item from real life. Now I didn't know that much about Matthew at this time. This is pretty early. I found out later that Matthew almost always wrote from real life. Okay, this was his modus operandi, is to write actual real life anecdotes, which he might embellish, of course. So this Quails is a travelogue writer, and he travels all over the New England states, And most of the time, it's not sketches, humorous sketches like this. It's, letters to the editor about his travels. He pretends to be an old man who works for the government in some unknown capacity. And I immediately knew that this was Matthew's writing. And furthermore, when I read this, I realized that this was a story about Mathew and Abby living in Methuen, okay? Because the town is M with a dash, so that's Methuen. And then there's there's two lazy characters who have a contest as to which one is lazier. One of them is W, and one of them is P. Well, Matthew's last name is Whittier, and Abby's last name is Poyen, and this is Methuen. And the story is that the laziest one who wins the contest was so lazy he couldn't even tell the judges why he was the laziest one. He was just too lazy to tell them, and he wins the 2 cows that are put up for the prize. And I got a past life hit off of this. I remembered that this was after Mathew and Abby lost their son Joseph at 11 months old from scarlet fever. I extrapolated some of this later, but Matthew's second cousin, Richard Whittier, who had a farmhouse there in Methuen, invited them to come and stay with him because the local townspeople where they were living in Amesbury, Massachusetts, were persecuting them for their anti-slavery work and also for Abby's interest in the occult and mysticism and so on. They were accusing her of being a witch. And then they lost their son. They were impoverished because the people were shunning them. So they stayed in Methuen to recover. And Abby was in terrible shape. This is the time when they would have started writing A Christmas Carol. Matthew would have suggested it to pull her out of her depression. But in the meantime, what was happening was that Mathew didn't dare leave her alone. He was afraid she was going to throw herself in the river when she went for these long walks by the river. I think it's called the Spigot River or something like that. So he would have to stay with her to kind of chaperone her, because he wouldn't tell her that, but that's why. This is what my past life memory tells me. And the townspeople were so mean that they accused him of being lazy. Here they were grieving for their child. But see, back then, children were lost. They were dropping like flies right and left, and, wasn't that big a deal to them, to the people. To Mathew and Abby, this was their precious son. So this is the point at which they started writing A Christmas Carol. But anyway, I knew that Mathew was Quails in the Boston Weekly Museum, and I knew that they had lived in Methuen, and that the medium, Joseph Shield, was correct. When Abby told him to pair the name Mathew and Methuen together, that was her way of locking it in, see, as a piece of evidence. Well, if you've watched the best of mediums on YouTube, and there's a bunch of them, I've been watching Matt Fraser lately, that they do this pretty routinely. They'll get a character, and they'll get a sound, and they'll get the name, and then they'll ask you, does this name, can you take this name? Does it mean anything to you? Well, this medium was doing exactly the same thing, except it related to my past life instead of somebody else. So that was all well and good, except that, I better put this back in its plastic here, except that when I looked up Quails, and I did try to do some research online with these things so I didn't make some statement that was, incorrect, that historians knew was incorrect. The historian said that Quails was written by an entertainer named Ashen Dodge. Well, at that point, the gauntlet was thrown, and I had a serious problem on my hands. So I went in and I accessed every single edition of the Boston Weekly Museum. I read every single Quails letter, and I looked for clues. And I finally was able to disprove it, that Ashen Dodge was Quails. He was not. Mathew, during this time, was an undercover agent, probably a liaison for William Lloyd Garrison. He wasn't the only one. There was many agents like this. But Mathew apparently was traveling as a liaison, and he would contact people for William Lloyd Garrison. So he didn't dare blow his cover. And as a matter of fact, when Ashen Dodge, see, what happened was that somebody that wrote for the paper saw that the itinerary was kind of similar between Ashendaj and Quails, and they decided that Ashendaj was writing it. Well, that wasn't what was happening. Mathew was ghostwriting for Ashendaj's comic performances, his routines. So for a while they were traveling together, and somebody, connected the dots wrong and assumed that Mathew was the writer. Well, Mathew went along with it. He played along with it because it deepened his cover. This stuff sounds totally wild, but this is what my research has uncovered. Well, at some point I was able to prove that Mathew was the writer of Quails, and this is how I did it. I'm going to show you. Quails goes overseas to Europe. He attends the World Peace Congress. He also goes to the London World's Fair, which was held in what was called the Crystal Palace, a big glass building. Well, I've got an image of the Crystal Palace here that I can show you, because this is the London Illustrated News. Okay, so I think you'll be able to see this. If not, I can cut it in. It's pretty awkward to do this in front of a camera, but I want to show you the original volumes. There's a certain charm in having the originals. This, if you can see it, is what the Crystal Palace looked like. This is 1851. It's pretty incredible. And this is what it looked like on the inside. These volumes are not cheap, by the way. That's what the Crystal Palace looked like. That's one shot on the inside. The thing was vast. Now, Mathew did go to the Crystal Palace. He went to the Crystal Palace, but he also attended the World Peace Congress. And it so happens that an artist did a very, very detailed full-page spread of the opening of the World Peace Congress. In the meantime, Quails, and I'll do a close-up of that, Quails has told us that when he was attending, he's a reporter. He was trained as a reporter. He knew shorthand, so they put him, excuse me, I'm looking down in the picture instead of in the camera. They put him in the reporter's box. So Quails tells us he was in the reporter's box. Now, there's no indication anywhere that Ashendaj, the rubber-faced guitar-playing performer, knew shorthand or had any credentials to be a reporter. So right there you got a serious problem for Ashendaj being the writer of Quails, because there's no way that they would let him in the reporter's box. Okay, no matter how famous. He wasn't famous in Europe anyway. As a matter of fact, he had recently bombed in New York City. He was in London. He was there to try to restart his career after having bombed in New York City. He was not going to the World Peace Congress, although he claimed it all his life, see, because he wanted to claim Quails. So I said, well, if Mathew was Quails, and if he was in the reporter's box, and if we have a very detailed sketch of the opening of that whole room in Exeter Hall, he should be there, and he is. And I'm going to have to cut in those shots here in the video for you. But he's there, and it's not Ashendaj. It's Mathew. As a matter of fact, Mathew, I have a portrait of him, and I'll have to cut that in also, where on the left side of his head there's a curl, a loop of hair that sticks out for some reason. Well, that loop is the illustrator for the Illustrated London News. Apparently was so good he must have used a magnifying glass, because he's got that loop in there, So this is Quails as Mathew. Now Quails meets with Victor Hugo in Paris. So, he was William Lloyd Garrison's liaison to Victor Hugo, who was a social activist, see, in Paris, as well as a number of other people. So that was pretty interesting. So now I know that Quails was definitely Mathew. But then, in the meantime, I bought this on eBay. Let me see how close we can get to that. This carved box belonged to John Greenleaf Whittier. For some reason, it's not focusing real well. There we go. And I bought this on eBay. Nobody else bid on it. It was $100. And that's amazing for anything that belonged to John Greenleaf Whittier. I just must not have come to anybody else's attention. Well, what is it? It looks like, well, first off, there's a little tiny, tiny carved box inside the box. Okay. And And in the bottom, there's a note from the official Whittier biographer, who was also Matthew's son-in-law, who was also his longtime enemy. It's fallen into 4 pieces. I won't take it out here now, but with his signature, it authenticates that this belonged to John Greenleaf Whittier. In the meantime, in the little box are 2 little carved deer. When I say little, they're half an inch long. They're tiny, and they're broken. I'll have to fix this later because the little base came out. They're broken, and that was pretty odd. I'm like, well, that's cool to have something that belonged to John Greenleaf Whittier. But then I found something else. Then I found that in one of the Quails episodes, and this is how I'm tying this together, okay? In one of the Quails episodes, Matthew is in Lucerne, Switzerland, and he writes, this is from the, I think it's December 3rd, 1851 edition. They were, they were published quite a bit later than when Matthew was on location. That he was actually back home by the time this was published. He says, the Swiss peasantry have long been noted for their ingenuity, which they manifest in their leisure hours in whittling out representations of Swiss scenery, hunting scenes, dairy scenes, and images or statues of different eminent persons. Some of these whittlings are exquisite beyond description, representing perfectly formed animals and persons less than half an inch in length, every limb and feature being as carefully carved as the marble statues in Westminster Abbey in London. In other words, this is something that Matthew purchased in Lucerne, Switzerland, when he was writing his Quails. I had bought it without knowing that it had once belonged to Matthew. So here's what I'm pretty sure had happened. Matthew bought that as a Christmas present for his little sister, Elizabeth. This is what I think. And then when Elizabeth died in 1864, I believe it was, the ownership would have gone to John Greenleaf Whittier. And then on from there, when he died, it would have gone to his niece, Matthew's daughter, Elizabeth. When she died, her husband, Samuel Picard, would have given it to John Townsend Trowbridge, who knew all of the Whittiers. He had a room just for mementos and knickknacks. He also knew how to carve. I'm guessing that it was John Townsend Trowbridge that carved this box. The person I bought it from said he bought it either, he couldn't remember exactly where, but in or near Arlington, Massachusetts, which is where John Townsend Trowbridge lived. So I'm guessing that these were carved by somebody in Lucerne, Switzerland. Matthew bought them there, and they went all the way down to John Townsend Trowbridge. Now, these things are not deer. They are chamois. Now, I've been pronouncing them chamois for ages because I didn't know that it was a French word and that the correct pronunciation was chamois. But that's what these are. They're like kind of a cross between a goat and a deer. They're not really little deer at all. So I think that's pretty definite. Now, there isn't too much else I wanted to share here, but I did want to show how I proved Matthew's authorship of some of these obscure pieces that were claimed by or for obscure authors. I can't go into the famous ones because I am writing articles for Real Paranormal Magazine about those. But I can show you the methods that I used in proving some of the lesser known ones. So whenever I bring up Quails and claim Matthew Franklin Whittier as the author of that travelogue, and the historians are absolutely certain that it was Ash and Dodge, well, they're going on a false, on fake news, basically. Because what happened is that once that rumor got started by one of the contributors to the paper, Ash and Dodge and the editor colluded to make it fact. And actually, at the very end of the run of that paper, the editor comes out in black and white and says that Ash and Dodge was Quails, and he surely knew better, so he lied about it. And then Ash and Dodge bought out the paper, so there was some underhanded dealings going on there. Matthew could not come out. He, instead of coming out and saying it, he embedded clues in his writing. And there are enough clues in there to see both that he did that and also that he definitely was Quails and not Ash and Dodge. He did the same thing with The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe. He did the same thing with regard to A Christmas Carol. And all of that evidence will be coming out in the articles that I'm publishing in Real Paranormal Magazine. So I know this is longish. I'm going to go ahead and insert the close-ups, and as long as I get at least a reasonable number of people watching these, I'll go ahead and keep doing them. When my poll for my not iPhone, I don't have an iPhone, when my cell phone comes in, I will go ahead and go out in Portland if we're still got some viewers, and I'll go ahead and do things like stand in front of the house that I think Mathew and Abby lived in. And that was the house where, as I seem to remember by past life memory, she hung silk purple cloth as tapestry over the walls. Now, she came from an upper-class French family, so that would have been a fairly typical thing for somebody whose father was a marquis to do if she found herself in humble circumstances. She had some silk cloth and she hung it as a tapestry over the walls. After she died, apparently, Mathew went ahead and had those made into curtains in a fit of stoicism, because he was a Stoic philosopher. But then once the shock, you go into shock after somebody dies and you don't feel anything emotionally. Well, he thought he was just fine because of his study of Stoicism and belief in life after death. Well, when that emotional shock wore off and he had given away almost everything of hers, all he had left were those purple curtains. That is why the purple curtains show up in The Raven, and they also show up in a poem called Lady Geraldine's Courtship, plagiarized by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And that's why historians can't figure out why the almost identical line shows up in The Raven and Lady Geraldine's Courtship. It's because Mathew wrote them both. And it's because that was Abby's tapestry that he'd had made into curtains. And that was the only thing he had left of hers. See, so that's why the almost identical line about purple curtains shows up in both poems. Well, historians have never guessed such a thing, but basically I've got a lot of evidence. The context is very deep for this, and I'm going to be talking about some of those things later on too. Thanks for watching.